Hello and welcome to this 360-degree virtual tour of the Ards Peninsula in County Down. We're going to be tracing the legacy of Ulster-Scots settlers who made this place their home 400 years ago. Now, the scene that you're standing in now has been filmed with a 360-degree camera, which means that you can look all around you using your mouse at home or perhaps using a VR headset. And today we are in Comber, a pretty plantation town. And if you look to my left, you'll see a map that shows you where Comber is located. So we are in this square, in the centre of the town. There are 4 roads radiating out from this central point, one to the north, one to the south, one to the east behind me, and one to the west, with this square or diamond in the centre. This was a very common form of town planning for the Scots settlers, and you'll find towns and villages with a square in the centre in Ballygowan and Hollywood and Newtownards and Portaferry, often with a market house in the centre. Common type of Scottish town planning. In the early 17th century, the lands around East Ulster here were granted by the King, King James, to 2 Scottish Lairds, Sir Hugh Montgomery and Sir James Hamilton. And the plan was that they would come here to Ulster and they would bring tenants and settlers who would farm the lands and make new towns and new villages. You can see portraits of James Hamilton and Hugh Montgomery to my left and my right. So Hamilton and Montgomery were keen to make some money from this new opportunity. They brought across their settlers and they began having trade and markets and churches and really forming a new settlement in the area. In the 1620s, Sir James Hamilton appointed a map maker, a man called Thomas Raven. And Thomas Raven's brief was to go out and map all of the lands of this new settlement to show the geographical features, the landscape, the town lands, the areas where people were living, and even the names of the settlers. This would allow James Hamilton to track the success, really, of his settlement. Those maps are absolutely fascinating. The Raven maps, they're called. They have been digitised. They're available for the public to view at a local museum in Bangor. And one of the interesting things about the map of Comber, which you can see if you look to my right, is that there's not 1, but 2 Combers. New Comber and Auld Comber. Auld is the Scottish word for old. New Comber is gone. It lay just a mile or so to the south of the town here on this side. It was Sir James Hamilton's village. And although we can see on the map that it had a recreation park and a market cross, no trace of that survives. However, Auld Comber, where we are now, this was given to Sir Hugh Montgomery. And you can actually see the old church, probably where the parish church is now behind me. You can also see townland names like Cattogs, Ballynichol, Carnashur. Those are still here today. You can see the names of some of the early settlers like Hamilton and McKee and Brown, all marked in this map, and those are still there. Very interesting that we still have this tangible connection with the settlers of 400 years ago through names of townlands and people and families. So let's take a look at the square we're in now. The most obvious feature is this statue behind me. Standing 55 feet high, on the top of this column stands Major General Sir Robert Rollo Gillespie, a hero of the town. His family were originally of Scottish descent, and Gillespie is famous in this town. You can see a portrait of him if you look over here to my right-hand side. On the northwest corner of the square, we have the War Memorial. And again, the plinths on each side of this memorial record the names of those who served and fell in the First World War, and many of those surnames are Scottish. On the left-hand side of the square, you can see this large building. You can also see an old image of how it used to look. This was the grand home of the Andrews family. The Andrews family were the landlords, the businessmen, the big family of the area. And they had come over here, the Andrews family, again in the early 1600s, of Scottish origin. Many of them are buried in the family mausoleum, which is in the grounds of the parish church of St Mary behind me. You see it in the corner of the square. But to hear a little bit more about the Andrews family and their work and industry and enterprise in Comber, we're going to journey in that direction, up the hill. So maybe after you've had a wee look round, you might come with me. We're standing now on the outskirts of the town of Cumber, and behind me are a couple of very interesting buildings, both connected to the Ulster-Scots Andrews family, who I mentioned when we were in the square. But before I tell you about these buildings, turn and look behind you. You see this lovely little winding street making its way up the hill? Well, that is called Braeside, B-R-A-E-S-I-D-E. And a Bray in Scots, or an Ulster-Scots, is a small hill. So this reminds you of the Scottish heritage of this area. But let's have a little look now at this beautiful sandstone building. This was the John Andrews and Company flax spinning mill. And if you look to my right-hand side, you can see some images of the mill and the mill workers in its heyday. So the mill opened in 1864. And for 150 years, it was a big employer here in Cumber, with about 500 people working in it, including a lot of children who worked half the time and went to school half the time. So they were known as half-timers. In fact, the school is that little building that you see over there behind the pretty pink clematis. Flax was a huge industry in Ulster. After the Industrial Revolution, big mills like this were opening all across the countryside as Ulster-Scots workers and others harvested the flax plant and wove it into linen yarn or wove it into linen cloth. So that was a big industry for the Ulster-Scots, and the Andrews family mill brought employment to many people here. Andrews family are also remembered in this building behind me, but it's a more sad story. This is the memorial hall to Thomas Andrews Jr., who was a shipbuilder in the company of Heartland and Wolfe. Now, shipbuilding had first arrived in Ulster, really, with a Scotsman called William Ritchie, who set up a shipyard in Belfast in the 1700s. Fast forward through the Victorian era, and the geography of Belfast and the ingenuity of our businessmen saw the company Heartland and Wolfe rise and prosper to become the biggest in the world. Thomas Andrews from Cumber worked in Heartland and Wolfe. He made his way up through the ranks to become a managing director and one of the leaders of the design department, designing ships for the White Star Line, including Titanic, which memorably sank on her maiden voyage to New York in that freezing April night of 1912. When word reached Cumber that Titanic had sunk and that Thomas Andrews had drowned, there was an outpouring of grief. The people of Cumber came together to build this memorial hall in his memory. His wife cut the first sod and his infant daughter laid the first stone. And there are images of the memorial plaques to those events just to the left-hand side here. So these two buildings behind me then commemorate two of the greatest industries in Ulster in the Ulster-Scots era, the production of linen and shipbuilding. I hope you've enjoyed this introduction to Cumber. Maybe you'll be inspired to come and visit here for yourself, or you might like to continue with us now on some more of our Ulster-Scots virtual tours. Thank you.